Welcome. My name is Maria, and I'm a content marketer here at Speak Up. I create a lot of content like blogs, white papers, some webinars on the EU Whistleblowing Directive and more. Today we're hoping to shine some light on the topic with you. Today we have with us Sarah Partridge-Smith. Sarah is a senior associate at Dentons UK, and she specializes in financial crime compliance and investigations. She's here to help us understand the implications of the EU Whistleblowing Directive for organizations in the UK.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I hope you're all well.
Well, thank you again for joining here. Before we dig into the discussion, I would like to clarify a few things. The webinar will last for approximately 45 minutes, and we want this webinar to be interactive. So please, if you have questions for Sarah, feel free to ask them in the chat. And our moderator, Kiki, will be going through your questions and sending them through. And if for time reasons we don't manage to answer all of your questions during the live webinar, we will make sure to get back to you via email. Also good for you to know that this webinar will be recorded and shared with you to watch on demand whenever you want via email. I suggest that we get started. We'll first talk about the law and some general information about it for the first 20 minutes of the discussion, and there from that point onwards, we'll move to more specific questions. Sarah, what is the EU Whistleblowing Directive about, and whom does it protect?
So the EU Whistleblowing Directive aims to put in place common minimum standards of protection across the EU to whistleblowers who raise breaches of EU law with their employer. The overarching aim was to ensure that people connected to any workplace could make reports, that those reports would be taken seriously, that they would be investigated, and that the reporter themselves would be protected from retaliation as a result of that report. It came about because legislation, member states each had their own approaches to whistleblowing. Some of them were very comprehensive, and we'll go on to talk about the UK. Others were less so, and some had no protections in respect of whistleblowers. And that resulted in a lot of inconsistency, particularly where companies were based across multiple jurisdictions in Europe. So the idea was to put in place that minimum standard of protection that employers could expect and that companies would be required to enforce. Who does it apply to? Well, it applies much broader than you would think. It applies to employees of a company, and that includes part and full-time employees, it includes agency employees, and it includes people on fixed-term contracts and trainees. But it also extends to a number of people that wouldn't previously been covered in most jurisdictions by any whistleblowing provisions. So that includes people that used to work for your company, people that are applying to work for your company, suppliers, people providing services to a company, contractors, subcontractors, shareholders, and even freelancers who are themselves self-employed will be covered by the EU directive. And it also covers any of those people that are going through a tendering process. So the remit for the Whistleblowing Directive is really very broad. It also applies to volunteers, if you have any volunteers in your company. And protection from retaliation also applies to the family and the colleagues and any facilitators of people making those reports, even where those people are not connected to your company in any way. So it really is a very broad application and requirement for companies to adhere.
That is indeed a very broad group of people. It's almost everyone who has ever interacted in the company in any sort of way. When it comes or in the UK, so
I'm sorry, Maria, I didn't catch that last thing that you said.
Who does the law concern?
My apologies. So it applies within EU member states to all companies, so public companies and private companies with 50 or more employees, or with an annual turnover or total assets of more than £10 million. And now, again, that is the minimum directive under that directive. And each EU state has considered how it should apply in their domestic legislation. So it also applies to companies of any size that operate in financial services or where there is a risk of money laundering or terrorist financing. So all of those companies that would be caught by AML regulation across EU member states. There have been a number of different approaches, and this is where it gets really fun for some of us, not all of us, on the EU directive, is that different member states have decided to apply that, even that membership and criteria differently. So, for example, in Cyprus, Latvia and Spain, they don't have the minimum employee requirement for any public sector company. So it applies to all public sector companies. And in respect of local authorities, although there's a minimum standard of 10,000 people to whom services should be supplied to, in Cyprus, again, that is removed. And it's reduced down to 5,000 employees. So again, very, very different in how different states are approaching this.
And what about all the deadlines? Because the directive has been around for a while already. So it might sound like old news by now. But have we crossed all of the deadlines?
Not yet, and that will depend on who you're talking about. So your first deadline, the first deadline to be concerned about was the 17th of December 2021. So that is old news. It's 2 years ago. And that was the point by which all member states were required to have implemented their domestic legislation. So by that point, a grand total of 5 of the 27 member states had managed to meet that deadline. And even by this time last year, only 10 states had managed it. And we are still struggling to get there. Poland and Estonia have still not fully implemented their domestic legislation and have now been referred to the European Court of Justice and are likely to be fined. For firms, the deadline is slightly different. So for firms holding more than 250 employees across jurisdictions, the requirements should have been met by the 17th of December 2021. So that deadline has passed, although it would have been almost impossible for any firm to have met that because the domestic legislation wasn't in place for almost all of them. It is in place now, so adherence should be complied with as soon as possible. If you've got between 50 and 250 employees, then your deadline is the 17th of December this year. So we are hurtling towards it. And I would expect member states to start thinking about enforcement and investigations into effective whistleblowing requirements probably next year.
Yeah, that is indeed coming up pretty soon. And from experience, knowing that, setting up your mechanism and your policies in place and getting them adopted by your employees takes some time. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's going to be, again, very few interesting months to come. But if we already start talking about more specific topics, so I would like to dig a little bit into the actual obligations of the directive and more specifically, the exact requirements when it comes to setting up your internal whistleblowing mechanism.
Yeah, so there's 3 things really to consider. How are you going to allow people to report? How are you going to deal with those reports? And how are you going to protect the people making those reports? So the directive puts in place quite precise requirements, minimum standard requirements, and these will have been followed and must be applied to in all jurisdictions, although there may be some differences in application again that we'll talk through shortly. So there must be internal reporting channels which employees can use to report breaches of EU law. And we'll dig out into that in a moment because that has been applied very differently in different states. There must be somebody appointed within your company to receive and to triage those reports. That applies to everybody. The reports must be acknowledged within 7 days. Again, that applies to everybody. And all concerns must be investigated and feedback given within 3 months. And you must also provide information on how to report externally. And the confidentiality of the reporter must be protected. And we'll talk about the difference in a moment between confidentiality and anonymity, I'm sure.
Yes, that is indeed a question that comes up quite often. If we want to help organizations get initiated, that organizations that haven't yet started their efforts to comply, what steps would you suggest they take?
So I'd start from a practical perspective. So think about your reporting mechanisms first. How are you going to make sure that your reporting channels are accessible? So look at your local jurisdictional requirements. The EU directive requires people to ensure that there is a reporting channel, and that can either be, reports can either be made in writing or orally. In some states, it's both in the domestic legislation. So you'll have to look at where you are operating to make sure that you are getting the right reporting channels in place. You're going to need to provide clear and transparent information on how to report. You're going to need to think about your resourcing, who is best placed to take those reports at the end, who is best placed to receive them, who is best placed to triage them, and who's best placed to investigate. Think about accessibility in terms of local languages. How are you going to make sure that people in different jurisdictions are able to report effectively and be understood? And think about how you're going to make those channels available to your third parties, your suppliers. That's a really big one. How are you going to make those channels understood to the people that you are dealing with outside of your organization, including those applicants and those previous employees as well?
Yeah, that is a very interesting point to mention. And correct me if I'm wrong, Sarah, on this, but setting up reporting channels for third parties, it is not an explicit requirement of the directive. Is that right? But a lot of organizations still choose to do it anyway.
Yeah, that's right. So there's a requirement that for retaliation. So you have to protect from retaliation. But how are you going to protect them from retaliation unless you allow them to report, right? And the key thing to remember, the key purpose, the key driver for the whistleblowing directive is to think about it positively. So what do you want a whistleblowing directive? What do you want a whistleblowing framework to achieve for you, for your company? Yes, you need to comply with the legislation. Yes, we want to avoid penalties for non-compliance. But what do we want to achieve by putting this in place? And what we want to achieve is ensuring that any misconduct is identified, is reported, and can be dealt with in-house by you. So it can be dealt with before it raises to an issue of an official complaint, a regulator investigation, a police investigation, before you get excessive turnover, because you've got somebody within your organization that is behaving so badly that they are driving other people out. So see it as a positive measure to find out what is happening in your organization and to combat that. And that will include suppliers. It will include getting all of the relevant information from all the people that may have that information. You want them to come to you rather than to go to a regulator or an enforcement authority, right?
Definitely. And when it comes to, the responsibility of organizations in all of this, how can they prove that they're doing everything they can to protect whistleblowers?
So record keeping is going to be key here, right? So we want to document what you're doing. So we want a written whistleblowing policy. We want processes in place that show your employees, show your suppliers, show whoever you're opening your whistleblowing facilities to how to make that report. You want a process written down. How are you going to handle those investigations? How are you going to handle those reports? You want it to be clear, you want it to be transparent, and you want it to be recorded. So if anybody asks, you can hand them over your documents.
That's helpful. I think we should dig a little bit into what we are here to discuss, right? And that's providing UK specific advice to our viewers, because you mentioned earlier that different member states have come up with different rules, and they've adjusted to the directive to their own needs. So when it comes to UK, we all know that the UK is no longer part of the European Union. How is the country still indirectly concerned by the directive?
So it's concerned in a couple of ways, really. Primarily, no business, very few businesses operate only within the UK. So we have businesses here that have operations elsewhere. We have suppliers, or we have supply chains that are coming through other countries almost all of the time. So we'll have to think about it in terms of your operationalization. So the directive imposes obligations on employees, on employers who operate in member states. So that doesn't require you to be established in a member state. It doesn't require you to be registered in a member state. So subject to the precise wording of every member state's legislation, which may apply this slightly differently, even where an employer doesn't maintain an EU registered entity, they could still find themselves within scope to the extent that they have workers operating from one of the jurisdictions. So that's a really important thing to consider when you are looking at your compliance landscape. You'll also want to think potentially if you've got any suppliers based in the EU, and in terms of your ESG requirements, are you making sure that they are compliant with any whistleblowing requirements that are on them? So it may be something that you reach out to them. And also in terms of horizon scanning as well, we'll talk shortly. The UK has the PIDA requirements in place, which provide some retaliation protections in respect of whistleblowers, but it is not the same as the EU Whistleblowing Directive. But there are steps being taken in the UK to bring into force for certain companies, certain types of companies, whistleblowing frameworks that are broadly equivalent. So it is worth keeping it in mind in terms of both your current organisation and your horizon scanning as well.
So you mentioned the PIDA, but that has been a legislation that's been around in the UK way before the EU Whistleblowing Directive came into play, right?
Yeah.
What are the biggest differences between the two legislations?
So the directive is more prescriptive. So the UK's PIDA law does not require firms to put in place a whistleblowing framework. It doesn't require confidential or anonymous reporting. It doesn't require triage or investigation. What it does require, and what it only requires, is that where somebody has made a complaint, has made a whistleblowing complaint, that they are protected from any retaliation. So if they are dismissed or victimized as a result of a whistleblowing complaint, that individual will have the right to bring a claim against their employer in the employment tribunal. So it's more prescriptive in that way, in that it requires companies to proactively put something in place. The directive also applies to far more people. I've just outlined who the directive applies to. Mm-hmm. For the PIDA legislation, it only applies to workers, and the definition of workers in the UK is again narrower than the directive legislation. So here, when we're talking about workers, we are talking about people that are directly contracted to provide a service of employment here. We aren't talking about freelancers, shareholders, volunteers. We're not talking about non-executive directors. So the PIDA protections do not extend to them, and they certainly don't extend to third parties or to families.
And what about the whistleblowers? Are they equally protected under the two regulations, or do they have different rights?
Well, that will depend on a state-to-state basis, because the retaliation measures that have been put in place vary wildly between member states. But the UK protection for those workers within that tighter definition is broadly equivalent to most member state protection, but it is much, much narrower.
All right. So I was wondering if you think there's going to be some new legislation coming up in the UK, or a general movement, let's say, towards covering, the gap that's probably being created by the directive.
So that's an interesting one. And your heart says yes and your head says no. I think it will develop, but it will develop piecemeal. So some of our listeners will probably be aware that the Financial Conduct Authority has put in place a much more comprehensive requirements for financial services firms, which are much more closely aligned to the Whistleblowing Directive. So financial services firms in the UK are already required to have in place adequate whistleblowing frameworks for reporting. They're required to be able to deal with anonymous reporting, and they are required to keep reporting confidential, as well as ensuring that retaliation is not permitted, and they are required to appoint somebody as a whistleblowing champion. So in the same way somebody is appointed to review and receive those reports. But that is very limited. It's limited to the financial services authority, to the financial services firms in terms of enforceability of those requirements. There's wider frameworks in place in the UK, so a lot of public sector organisations will have the whistleblowing frameworks in place already, albeit that they don't work always, and the protections that are applied are fallible. And we've heard a lot of stories about that, and a lot of stories about people not being confident around the whistleblowing frameworks that are in place in respect of the public sector. And we have other regulatory bodies that are making very strong suggestions or requirements that their membership applies those frameworks as well. So the Chartered Accountants will have requirements. Solicitors Regulation Authority has requirements. So there is movement towards it, but it's informal and piecemeal. There has been a grassroots campaign for an overhaul in the UK to bring it more into line with the directive, and particularly to expand the concept of workers to cover a more comprehensive cross-section of people. However, it stalls. There doesn't seem to be the political will to move it, and everything seems to go forward through private members' bills. So we've had a private members' bill in the House of Lords now since last December, which is stalled at a second reading, actually. And it made, it wanted to repeal PEDA altogether and put something else in place. That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen in that way. There's going to need to be much more comprehensive cross-party support to get something moving. Now, having said all of that, what is interesting is the government's move towards a focus on economic crime. And again, a lot of people listening here will be aware of the Economic Crime Bill, which was passed last week, which has introduced a failure to prevent offence for private companies in the UK. Now, that is going to, by the back door, require firms to have, at the very least, in relation to financial misconduct, comprehensive systems and controls to detect, investigate, and report fraud and financial misconduct. It already exists in respect of ABC, and there are already obligations in respect of AML. So almost by the back door, these obligations are being brought in because, of course, these whistleblowing requirements enable people within these companies to make those reports confidently. And to enable those to be triaged and reported. So we're moving that way, but in terms of having a similar piece of overarching legislation in the same way as the EU directive, or having that transplanted into the UK law, I don't think so. But we've always been piecemeal. We've never been a codified legal system, so it's not surprising that we'll just get there a slightly different way, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That's how we tend to progress anything in the UK in terms of the legal system.
You know, I always say progress is always progress, no matter the pace. You just talked about, organizations in the UK. Okay, the progress is slow, but organizations still need to establish their reporting frameworks, whether for one legislation or another. What would you say are the biggest challenges that UK firms can face in doing that?
The biggest challenges, well, the The biggest challenges are not necessarily the biggest, the ones that you would think. So there are three things that I think you need to do as a UK firm, particularly a UK firm that operates in the EU. The first is to understand your legal requirements. So as I've mentioned a number of times during this webcast, it's not as easy as looking at the minimum requirements. You're going to need to understand where you operate and what your requirements are in each of those operating jurisdictions. So that's going to take some time to figure that out and to make sure that you are going to be compliant in all jurisdictions. And what you can choose is either to put in place frameworks in each of your operating jurisdictions that meet each of the requirements in that jurisdiction, or you can put in place a global policy. But if you put in place a global policy, you'll still want to understand the requirements of your operating jurisdictions to make sure that you're taking everything at its highest and put in place something that is compliant everywhere. Now, there are significant differences. I've not touched too much on them, but one of the things I know that Speak Up will be concerned about is the anonymous reporting line. So anonymous reporting is not required as part of the EU directive. It's confidential reporting. So that's a difference between being able to make a report and no one ever finding out who you were, and being able to make a report in your own name, but that information being kept as confidential and as private and as need to know as possible throughout the course of the investigation. Most of our member states, so 19 of the member states, either permit or don't speak to whether anonymous reporting is permitted. 3 member states don't permit it at all. So if you are operating in one of those member states, you need to either make sure, well, you certainly need to be aware that you are not allowed to have an anonymous reporting line. And if you do have an anonymous reporting line across your other jurisdictions, you need to make sure that it is not permissible to be used by the employees in that jurisdiction. So there are some really quite important differences, and that's why it's important to look at the legal framework. That having been said, once you've looked at the legal framework, you can move on. Your resources will come next. How are you going to set this up? Where are you going to set it up? How are you going to make sure that you're able to respond in all of your local languages? How are you going to make sure that you are accurately recording and transcribing and responding to, within 7 days, all the reports that are made? Do you have the right skill set to be investigating those reports? Are you a big enough company that you can investigate those reports without creating bias or a conflict of interest when you're investigating? So that's your practical framework that you'll need to think about before you get going. And then for me, the big bar, the big obstacle that firms need to face is cultural. How are you going to encourage your workers to use those reporting mechanisms? So they can be the protection from retaliation is great, because that tells your employees, if you make that report and you're scared to do so, we will provide you with protection. Nothing is going to happen to you. There will be no repercussions. We will protect you. Great. What it doesn't help you with, and this is so counterintuitive, but what it doesn't help you with is when you have a firm with a really positive, bonded team who don't want to report on each other. Getting those guys to make reports, that is your major cultural issue. Getting good teams that genuinely like each other to make reports. And that's a difficult one. That is the biggest challenge, I think, for firms.
That is very interesting, and I'm really glad to hear you say that, Sarah, because whenever we talk about whistleblowing systems and procedures and optimizing your tool, that's the number one topic we always talk about. It's culture, because you can have the best whistleblowing tool in the world, but if people don't feel like they want to use it, it's useless. And for us, it's actually what you were talking earlier about, anonymity. It all comes down to anonymity. Even though it's not mandatory, it's the ultimate way to prove that you mean what you say. So if you say, we're going to protect you, there's not going to be any retaliation, you don't have to explain much. You're 100% anonymous. We allow you to stay anonymous until the end. We don't have to provide more proof that you will be protected. No one knows who you are. So that's always big advantage, in our opinion, to allow people, to give people this freedom of remaining anonymous. And what it finally ends up happening is that anonymity helps you establish the connection with the person, and you sort of earn their trust, especially in the early stages of the communication cycle. And then most of them eventually want to reveal who they are,
That's right.
like willingly, because they know it's going to help conduct a better investigation. They know it's going to help you shed light on the situation if they do that. And because you gave them the option to remain anonymous, they take that option and they trust you more because of it. That's all a very interesting information. And I saw that we got a question from Mike that says, he was asking which jurisdictions do not allow anonymous reporting.
It is Bulgaria, Latvia, and Lithuania.
There you go.
But what's interesting, Maria, I think you're absolutely right what you just said. And in my experience, even when you have a firm that says, oh, we've got a whistleblowing line, we've got an email, you can just email HR, it's fine, we don't have any problems here. Actually, we're going to put in an anonymous reporting line, but we're just going to do it as a precaution because we think it would be useful, but we don't think anything's going to happen. Deluge. As soon as that anonymous reporting line comes in, there's a deluge. And often, actually, it's not in respect of financial misconduct, which people are perhaps more willing to report. It's in respect of bullying, low-level misconduct issues, sexual assault. Those are the things that seem to come through more quickly and more confidently through those anonymous reporting lines. So that is going to help you with your staff turnover issue. If people are leaving because of a toxic workplace, but nobody is confident enough to stand up and make that report, then an anonymous reporting line seems to assist in those circumstances.
Yeah, I was having a similar discussion a few days ago about the topic that most companies, they usually start by setting up a line for financial crime. And that's the realization that they come to, that, we've set up this line and we said it's going to be for fraud, but people are using it for all sorts of problems. Why didn't we do a global general channel where people can just raise concerns no matter what, and then we can figure out what it is?
And that's another difference as well, I think, in the EU. Another difference between the EU and the UK, and a difference between EU operating member states. So you'll remember that I said at the outset that the directive only requires you to put in place a whistleblowing line to report on breaches of EU law, which does cover financial misconduct. So it does cover breaches of the Money Laundering Directive, for example. But what it doesn't cover is breaches of a firm's own internal reporting policies. It doesn't cover breaches of any criminal law. So some countries, so in the UK is any breach of UK law is covered by whistleblowing disclosures. So PIDA applies to any breaches. In Germany, they've brought it in specifically in their domestic legislation to cover criminal law as well. And in other countries, they've brought in different standards. But just because your domestic legislation says, again, this is the minimum, it doesn't prevent companies expanding that and really making sure that they are aware through their reporting lines of any breaches of their policies and procedures, including their conduct requirements as well, to try and get an understanding early before a situation escalates.
So I'm curious, when it comes to let's say a British organization has set up their reporting mechanisms. Let's say they have subsidiaries in the EU, right? What would happen in cases where a British organization needs to investigate something that has happened in a different country, in an EU member state? What would be the things to keep in mind as a UK-based firm?
So there's going to be some data protection issues there. Which can usually be covered. And I'm going to put my hands up right now and say I am not a data protection lawyer here at Dentons. It's marvelous. I work with employment lawyers and I work with data protection lawyers on all of my investigations. But there are certain data protection issues that will need to be covered. They are surmountable. So the key thing in terms of investigations is making sure that you have people in place that are able to effectively investigate, that are able to get to the bottom of what the complaint is, that are able to take clear and proper accounts from all witnesses, that are able to properly investigate the documents and are able to reach findings. And also that people are comfortable with making disclosures to those people, that they don't think it's going to be covered up, that they don't think it's going to be, we don't want the manager of a team necessarily investigating the conduct of somebody that they go for drinks with on a Thursday night,
Mm-hmm. I see that we got a question from Sophie, which is Speak Up related. So Sophie, if you'll allow us, we can come back to you on the question after the webinar with more specific product information. I'm not the right person to ask this question. So we'll make sure to get your question answered. No worries. But I wanted to come back to the UK organizations, because for the time being, there is no sanction, right, for not having a system in place. So
that depends. If you are a financial services firm, absolutely. If you do not have a reporting framework in place as a financial services firm, you are you're in breach of SISC, which is a requirement, an FCA requirement, and that can be a significant financial penalty. And that can be individual liability as well. Some of you may recall the ex-head of Barclays Bank got into some quite nasty trouble recently for not dealing properly with whistleblowing complaints.
I mean, we say there is no sanction, right? But I think reputation damage is big enough sanction.
Yeah, of course. And actually, yes, there's regulatory risk that applies to a number of firms. You do need to have systems and controls in place. So you need to have systems and controls in place to deal with your risk of financial crime. And I think, as I said, with the Economic Crime Bill, with ABC requirements, AML requirements, a failure to have a reporting mechanism in place is going to be considered a breach of those systems and controls. You need to have a way of reporting misconduct, at least in relation to financial crime, But certainly from a reputational perspective, if people want to know that they can go to you, if they can come to you and they know that you're going to investigate, you're going to take it seriously, they're more likely to come to you than to go to the media. They're more likely to come to you than to go to your regulatory body. They're more likely to come to you than to go to the police. So we want to be on the front foot. If we need to be making disclosures to enforcement authorities, we want to do so having said we took this seriously. This is the information that we gathered. Either we completed a full investigation, or for very serious misconduct it may be appropriate to immediately refer, but you refer it with the reporter. You don't want to be the firm on the end of it having let this misconduct take place in your firm.
And what would your advice be to organizations when it comes to encouraging people, like providing this, okay, we have a tool for you in place. How can an organization actually make sure that people use it and raise it?
That is so hard, isn't it? And that will vary from company to company. That's going to be an assessment of the culture in place at your firm. And in some instances, as we said, this is going to be a cultural shift. So what is loyalty? Is it loyalty to your team? Is it loyalty to the firm? What is your interest? What is the best interest here? Is it in the best interest of people in your team to keep these things covered up? Or is it in the best interest of us as a team that this sorts of misconduct is reported and it's dealt with immediately? So it will be about training. It will be about discussions in team meetings and really encouraging that culture of transparency and openness, and making sure that everybody takes responsibility for addressing misconduct within their firm.
Yeah, we agree. We see eye to eye with you on that, and we generally like to stretch that, whistleblowing, especially in Europe, has this very negative connotation to it. That it's a bad thing, that you're betraying your group, that you're doing something you're not supposed to be doing, as opposed to like Americans, for example. They're often being made fun of in like TV shows and movies, that they like raise concerns for absolutely everything. But
well, they do, but they also get financially rewarded for raising concerns. So that is a key difference between the US and us.
Exactly. But we agree that it's a complete different approach to the matter, and that in Europe we often struggle with it. We feel guilty. What we want to stand for as a company is that, you're not doing anything wrong. You're just sharing something, trying to help everyone out. I saw this. Maybe someone should look into it. That's it. And that's why we encourage the low barrier friendly reporting style, which is not a lot of complicated steps to complete before you can raise your concern. It's just pick up the phone, say what you have to say, and we'll get back to you. Fully anonymous, preserve your identity, and we'll see. So for us, the first step is to establish a connection. And once that's done, then it's up to the organization to do the next steps, right? So that they earn the person's trust, and then the dialogue is established. You can collect the information that you need to conduct your investigation, all while remaining compliant to the directive and all relevant laws, right? So I was covering a little bit what Sophie asked in the chat, because reporters can share their name and their email address if they want within SpeakUp, but it's not mandatory. It will always be up to them to decide. You can always ask them, but they have the final word on whether they do it or not. So I see that we're almost out of time. If we have no other questions, I think we can wrap it up, unless you have something to add, Sarah?
No, I don't. Thank you for having me here today. And if anybody has any questions, then please do reach out. I love investigations chat.
Thank you very much for your time, Sarah. Thank you to all the participants for being here today with us. As I mentioned, we'll get back to you via email, Sophie, for that question. And if any of you need help or support implementing a policy, or you'd like more information on how to set up functioning, easy to reach mechanism, feel free to contact us. I would like to remind you that the recording of the webinar will be shared with you via email. And for now, I'd like to say thank you and wish you all a very nice day.